Hello there everyone. Okay, this will be the video for the 4.11 discussion and then on to the 4.12 lesson, A New Generation. Okay, so your discussion assignment is, why is Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech still important today? So make sure that you've gone through the previous lesson and have read through and have listened to Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, and then reflect upon that and what was his meaning and what was the message coming out of the I Have a Dream speech, and then reflect on current events of today, and is it still important, is it still meaningful yet today in our modern 21st century. So that's your discussion assignment, completed in the online discussion unless you complete it in a Class Connect assignment. Okay, then on to the 4.12 lesson, A New Generation. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. As the shocked and stunned nation grieved, Vice President Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as the nation's 36th president. For most black Americans, the shock of the assassination was accompanied by worries over the new president, who was a Southerner. But LBJ was no segregationist and moved swiftly to push the civil rights legislation Kennedy had proposed through Congress. Activists continued to demand additional reforms, while many Southerners continued to resist segregation. Impatient with slow progress of reform and convinced the current approach was too cautious, some black leaders began to take a more militant approach. Goals for this lesson: recognize the major provisions and impact of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, describe the struggle for black voting rights in the South, and identify major goals and achievements of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. And don't forget to go to lesson resources and grab your reading guide and or lesson answer key. And then we will begin with reading pages 818 through 825. From JFK to LBJ. November 22, 1963, the first bulletin cut into TV and radio programs just after 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. There had been national tragedies before, but nothing like the 4 days of shock and grief that followed, because no previous trauma had unfolded on television. Tens of millions saw instant images of Vice President Lyndon Johnson taking the oath of office as president, of the murder of Kennedy's assassin, of the solemn funeral procession on the streets of Washington, of the president's small son, John, saluting the coffin. And here's that very famous picture, JFK's widow, Jackie, and then his 2 small children, Caroline and John Jr., saluting as his coffin, the motorcade goes by. Very powerful picture. The assassination of President Kennedy stunned the nation. For black Americans who had come to see Kennedy as a friend of civil rights, if a cautious one, the shock was compounded by worries over the new president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, as a Southerner. Raised in isolated Texas Hill Country, Johnson had the same upbringing as many segregationists. He was a friend and ally of white supremacists such as Senator Richard Russell of Georgia. Many black and white liberals shuddered at the prospect of Johnson in the White House. But LBJ was no segregationist, far from it. As a young schoolteacher in Texas, he had worked with poor Mexican-American children. As Texas State Administrator of FDA's National Youth Administration in the 30s, he had scrupulously insisted that black teenagers be given a proportionate share of government work relief jobs. As Majority Leader of the Senate in the 1950s, he had marshaled support for the first significant bill to support civil rights. Johnson was a master politician, highly skilled in legislative warfare. In the White House, he could be profane and bullying in private. He would subject congressmen to the so-called Johnson treatment, backing them against a wall, grabbing them by their shirt collar, leaning in close, and applying both flattery and threats to secure their votes on important legislation. When he assumed the presidency, Johnson understood that the public's grief over Kennedy's death had stirred a groundswell of support for the Democratic agenda. He moved swiftly to push Kennedy's proposed civil rights legislation through Congress. LBJ devoted weeks to getting the bill through the House and Senate. He threatened, sweet-talked, and pressured members of his own party, as well as some sympathetic Republicans. The final breakthrough came in midsummer when Senate Republican leader Everett Dirksen of Illinois agreed to lend his party's support to the measure. Civil rights, he concluded, was an idea whose time had come. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law on July 2, 1964. The new law ended segregation in public accommodations, banned bias in hiring, and withheld federal money from any public program that discriminated on basis of race. Freedom Summer. Even as the ink was drying on the new Civil Rights Act, advocates in Washington pressed for further reforms. Their new goal was the right to vote, not just stated in words, but guaranteed in action, especially in the towns and villages where white officials still use a dozen tricks to keep blacks away from the ballot box. As the summer of 1964 began, SNCC and CORE recruited 1,000 students, most white, for a Freedom Summer campaign with the goal of registering hundreds of thousands of black voters in Mississippi. It was one thing for politicians and the press to ignore the plight of Southern blacks, but the organizers reasoned if white college students were brutalized by law enforcement officials, the world would take notice. The first volunteers headed south on June 20th. The next day, 3 of them, one black, James Chaney, and 2 whites, Michael Schwerner and Andrew Goodman, went missing in Philadelphia, Mississippi. They had been arrested by a local sheriff's deputy, released from custody several hours later, and then vanished. Several days later, their car was found burned. White Southerners said it was just a ruse to gain votes for the Southern traitor, Lyndon Johnson. Then on August 4th, the 3 bodies were discovered, buried in an earthen dam. All had been shot. Victims of a terror campaign that saw dozens of attempts to shoot volunteers, as well as a wave of bombings aimed at the churches and homes that hosted them. Strife of a different sort broke out at the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City. When Mississippi's Democratic Party refused to accept any blacks in its delegation to the Democratic National Convention, Freedom Summer organizers set up an alternative political party, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, that managed to enroll some 60,000 people. The MFDP sent a delegation to the Atlantic City Convention demanding to be seated in place of the all-white Mississippi delegation. Supporters of the MFDP attracted media attention and sympathy as they picketed the Atlantic City Boardwalk, carrying signs with pictures of the fallen Freedom Summer martyrs, Schwerner, Chaney, and Goodman. Fannie Lou Hamer, a founder of the MFDP, led the delegation to Atlantic City. 2 years earlier, she had made up her mind to register to vote. With only a 6th grade education, she failed the literacy test imposed on African Americans in Mississippi. The farmers whose land she had worked for 18 years as a sharecropper told her to leave her job and home immediately. Hamer went to work for SNCC and registered to vote the next year. She was arrested and beaten more than once for helping other blacks register to vote. At the 1964 Democratic Convention, in a televised hearing, she asked, "Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we are threatened daily because we want to live as decent human beings?" Sorry, this really gets me very emotional. Hamer pledged her delegates to support the Democratic nominee for president, a promise that white Mississippi delegation refused to make. But President Johnson, fearing another Dixiecrat revolt and wanting to keep the Democratic Party unified, suppressed the MFDP challenge after quiet attempts at a compromise failed. Many young white and black supporters of civil rights were sorely disappointed and felt they could not trust the Democratic Party. Johnson's Great Society. As the time approached for the election of Wait a minute, let me actually go back. I want to read some of these inserts that I've skipped over. The aftermath of the assassination. The first news bulletin of the president's assassination came in just after 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time on November 2nd, 1963. Communication satellites relayed the unfolding events live to a nation in shock. Camera crews climbed aboard the presidential airplane Air Force One, racing back to Washington. Aboard the plane at 2:38 p.m., they broadcast Lyndon Johnson taking the oath of office with his wife and a stunned Jacqueline Kennedy at his side. Meanwhile, in Dallas, a suspect in the assassination shot a patrolman before being subdued in a theater. Lee Harvey Oswald, the 24-year-old ex-Marine, was accused of the crime. 2 days later, while Oswald was being transferred to the Dallas County Jail, Jack Ruby, a local nightclub owner, stepped forward and killed Oswald. On the Sunday following the assassination, the president's flag-draped casket was taken to the Capitol. Hundreds of thousands lined up to pay their respects to the fallen leader. For many, it felt as though the nation had not only lost a president, but also the sense of hope and possibility he had embodied. Cold War fears fueled conspiracy theories. President Johnson quickly appointed a special commission chaired by Chief Justice Earl Warren to investigate the assassination. In the end, they pronounced that neither Oswald nor Ruby was part of any conspiracy, domestic or foreign, to assassinate President Kennedy. In 1979, a second investigation by a congressional committee cast doubt on some of the Warren Commission's findings. Controversy and speculation about the assassination continue to the present day. And then this other insert, the Warren Court. In the 1950s and 60s, the U.S. Supreme Court was led by Chief Justice Earl Warren. A former Republican governor of California, Warren had been appointed by the court by President Eisenhower. His background led people to expect a conservative jurist, but under Warren, the Supreme Court made decisions that pleased liberals most of all. After the landmark school desegregation ruling in Brown v. Board of Education, the Warren Court bolstered the rights of criminal defendants. Gideon v. Wainwright said that courts must provide an attorney for a defendant who could not afford one, while Miranda v. Arizona declared that in arresting suspects, police must first advise them of their right to remain silent and have an attorney. Your Miranda rights. Loving v. Virginia ended state bans on interracial marriage. New York Times Company v. Sullivan protected the press, under fire from libel suits filed by Southerners accused of race discrimination. Warren's fellow liberal justices included Felix Frankfurter, appointed by Franklin Roosevelt, and Thurgood Marshall, the first black Supreme Court justice appointed by Lyndon Johnson. And you might remember Thurgood Marshall's name from he was the leading NAACP lawyer in the Brown v. Board of Education case. Conservatives accused the Warren Court of being activists and exercising power rightly belonging to states and legislatures. Okay, on to Johnson's Great Society. As the time approached for the election of 1964, Johnson, though he had only been president for months, had already proposed an ambitious array of new programs in the spirit of his idol, Franklin Roosevelt. In his State of the Union address in January 1964, Johnson had declared the unconditional war on poverty in America. Later in the year, he announced that the United States must fulfill its destiny as a great society, with abundance and liberty for all. The Great Society, he said, demands an end to poverty and racial injustice, to which we are totally committed in our time. In the 1964 election, Republicans nominated the strongly conservative Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater, who wanted to limit government and abolish the income tax. He criticized the Warren Court and called for total victory in Vietnam. His tough rhetoric, extremism, and the defense of liberty as no vice, for example, energized his followers. Democrats painted him as a warmonger, and Johnson won in a landslide, carrying all but 6 states, Arizona and 5 in the Deep South. Just after his victory, Johnson urged his aides to move quickly with his Great Society proposals. Using all his persuasion and strong-arm tactics, Johnson pushed his agenda through Congress. Great Society programs vastly expended federal aid to elementary and secondary education, financed loans to college students, funded the arts and humanities, replaced urban slums with new housing projects, and provided job training programs. Perhaps most significant were Medicare and Medicaid, which guaranteed health care for the elderly and the poor, Head Start, which provided pre-kindergarten education to underprivileged children, and food stamps, which helped poor families keep themselves nourished. It was the biggest series of domestic programs since the New Deal. Johnson's ambitious initiatives met with mixed success. Urban renewal, for example, often meant nothing more than faceless public apartment towers that soon fell in decay. The war on poverty underestimated the complex roots of the problem and encouraged a cycle of dependency on government welfare checks. Medicare and Medicaid lightened the load of health care costs, but led to the long-term funding problems that persist today. Selma and voting rights. And I think I'm going to stop here with this video, and we'll start part 2 in the next video.